Hi, I'm Patrick Sullivan. This is a Recurring Insight, and for this episode, I'm going to be talking about Brazen Borrower. So Brazen Borrower is an interesting design to unpack because there are a lot of adventure designs and there's a lot of different ways you can go about executing something like adventure. And Brazen Borrower isn't the most intuitive execution. As I talk about in the video, there's sort of at least two paths that strike me as more intuitive of how you would execute an adventure design. And Brazen Borrower doesn't really follow that mold, but in spite of that, is a really great design that plays well, and in spite of the combination of things not being the most synergistic, strikes a tone that I think makes the design really compelling.
I think that Brazen Borrower is my favorite of all the adventure designs that is pointed towards constructed, in part because the novelty of the execution. I think as a designer, you would start in one of two places for most of the adventure designs, and they largely follow those heuristics. One is part A synergizes with part B. So you have Lovestruck Beast, and then Heart's Desire fulfills the attacking obligation. You have Beanstalk Giant, and then Fertile Footsteps Rampant Growths you closer to being able to cast the giant, and then also providing more mana for the stat bonus. The second is sort of hitting the same note twice. I think that you could look at Stomp and Bone Crusher Giant as being that sort of execution, where it deals 2 damage, and then it has another clause that deals 2 damage again under some set of conditions. Brazen Borrower is the third execution, which I think is the hardest to get right, which is here is some stuff. And there's definitely a tone to the card. I think having a 3/1 flyer that can't block along with a bounce effect, calling the card Brazen Borrower and Petty Theft, it gives off a tone and a vibe, but it really is sort of a collection of disparate things, which makes it a more novel execution and a harder one to get right than the easier ones, which is just A fulfills B or do the same thing twice. I also like that Petty Theft isn't really worth a full card under most circumstances, and that makes the card a lot less tense to play with. When you have Bone Crusher Giant in your hand, or really any of the other designs, there is a lot of pressure that you feel to try to extract a full card out of the first half, even if that's just a 1/1 token, or even if that's 2 damage directed at the player. You feel that pressure to try to extract the maximum value. I think that a bounce effect is easier to talk yourself into just ignoring and casting the card when the 3/1 flyer is appealing in a way that the other designs don't really do. And then lastly, the gameplay is excellent here. I think that a little bit of bounce goes a long way in constructed games. It's a hard thing to get right. Occasionally Unsummon shows up in decks. Sometimes bouncing and drawing a card is good enough to play, but often those effects don't really show up. And it's a shame because bounce plays really, really well in small doses. A lot of the most iconic bounce designs are things like Jace the Mind Sculptor or Waterfront Bouncer, where it's occurring turn after turn, but the occasional bounce effect is really dynamic in terms of how much of it's worth and really shifts the tone of combat or what's occurring on the battlefield. And then a 3/1 flyer that can't block, I think, is a great game piece. Brazen Borrower is also pretty good at taxing planeswalkers. It's very good at interacting with tokens. And so even though it is tilted towards an aggressive stance, it's not like Goblin Guide. You can play this in decks that are a little bit more controlling because the sum of the parts adds up to something that's flexible and powerful enough to play. And that's the last little bit about Brazen Borrower that I think is excellent, is a 3/1 flyer flash for 3 that can't block is not really a card you would consider for constructed decks. Certainly the double blue requirement pushes out of constructed. A 2-mana bounce spell, also not something you would ever really consider. So you are paying for the sum of the parts, but you do not need to play both halves in the same game to get your money's worth, depending on how the game goes. There are a lot of adventure designs that I think are pretty well executed in terms of being dynamic, in terms of the incentives shifting from game to game, but I think Brazen Borrower stands head and shoulders above the other designs in terms of the design being sort of novel, not about, oh look, here's A plus B and look how it works together, or here's the same thing twice, but instead just some stuff that's appealing and kind of works well together, but kind of doesn't. The incentives being phenomenal, and the gameplay being great as well.
So again, that was Brazen Borrower, and this is Recurring Insight. A couple things you can do from here. Make sure you're subscribing to the Star City Games YouTube page so you can get notified when new videos like this one and others get uploaded to the page. Throw a like and a comment up there as well. And celebrate the return of Harris. He was gone for weeks. And he showed back up at the door, and he's lost a little bit of weight, and he was covered in dirt, but he is feeling very affectionate and happy to be home. And make sure to show Harris a little bit of love in the comments as well.